Welcome to a new episode of Inside the Economist's Mind. Today we're taking a deep dive into a really significant period for the Australian economy, 2020 and 2021. Those years heavily shaped by the COVID-19 pandemic. We'll be drawing on a detailed summary from the Reserve Bank of Australia to unpack the economic shockwaves and, well, the initial stages of recovery.
Yeah, it's a fascinating period. What's so striking is just how unique that economic shock was.
Yeah.
It wasn't your typical downturn, not just financial issues or a simple demand drop. This was a global health crisis that needed immediate action. And those actions themselves had these huge worldwide economic consequences.
Right.
And the speed, the scale of the policy responses. Pretty remarkable, something we hadn't really seen before quite like that.
Okay, let's get into it then. Starting with that initial economic punch in 2020, there was that whole suite of public health measures, wasn't there? Things like shutting down travel international, even between states, closing non-essential businesses.
Yeah, your gyms, cinemas, pubs, restaurants.
Exactly. And then the stay-at-home orders, social distancing, and that massive shift, suddenly everyone's working and learning from their living rooms.
Yeah, absolutely. And lockdown became the word, didn't it? It's worth remembering how it rolled out, that national lockdown in March 2020, then more targeted state ones.
Melbourne had it tough for a long time.
It certainly did. A very long period of restrictions there. And then later, mid-2021, Delta brought back lockdowns in New South Wales, Victoria, the ACT.
Right.
And what's interesting, too, is even when official rules eased up a bit, say with Omicron, people's behavior didn't just snap back. Mobility stayed lower because, well, people were still being cautious.
So with all that going on, what was the immediate hit, the economic hit? Must have been pretty big.
Oh, it was sharp. A really significant contraction. You had businesses closing or operating under severe limits, hitting supply, and at the same time, demand just plummeted. People couldn't spend on services, and all that uncertainty, it just put a freeze on spending generally.
So it wasn't just one side of the equation.
Exactly. That's what made it so unusual. It hit both supply and demand hard. It wasn't just that people didn't want to buy things. Often they physically couldn't, and businesses couldn't operate.
And when you say significant, the numbers back that up, I assume?
They really do. Australia's GDP fell a massive 7%, just in the June quarter of 2020 alone.
7%. Wow.
To put that in perspective, it was the largest quarterly contraction we'd seen since World War II.
Okay, so let's drill down a bit. What drove that decline? Where did the economy feel the biggest pinch?
The biggest single factor, a really sharp drop in household spending, especially on services.
Like eating out, entertainment?
Precisely. Stuff you do outside the home. With everyone stuck inside, spending shifted towards goods for the home. Groceries, sure, but also home office gear, electronics, that sort of thing.
Right. Makes sense.
And here's something fascinating. Household savings rates just shot up dramatically.
Why was that? Just people being cautious.
That was part of it, definitely. Precautionary saving. But also, people simply couldn't spend on many things they usually would. And importantly, government support payments were flowing in, boosting incomes for many. This big buildup of savings, it acted almost like a coiled spring, ready to be released later.
Which helped the recovery down the track.
Massively. A key difference from your typical recession where savings often get wiped out.
Okay, so households cut back, saved more. What about businesses? How were they reacting?
Business investment also took a big hit. Demand was down. The outlook was, frankly, completely uncertain.
So they held back on spending.
Yeah, many just decided to postpone or cancel investment plans. Conserve cash, wait and see.
But government spending went up.
It did, quite substantially. That was the fiscal policy response kicking in, which we should definitely talk more about.
Okay. And net exports, you mentioned they technically increased?
Yeah, but it's a bit misleading. It was mostly because imports fell even more sharply than exports did.
Ah, right. So less demand for imported goods.
Exactly. And our big export earners like tourism and international education, they were devastated by the border closures. So imports fell due to travel bans and less consumption and investment spending on imported stuff.
And the human cost jobs? We saw a big spike in unemployment, didn't we?
We did. A rapid rise. It peaked at 7.5% in June 2020. And underemployment, people wanting more hours but not getting them, that surged too.
Some sectors were hit harder than others.
Definitely. Those contact-intensive industries, hospitality, arts, recreation, younger workers, female workers, often disproportionately affected too. And just a lot of people had their hours cut significantly.
But I seem to remember the official unemployment number didn't tell the whole story because of things like JobKeeper.
That's absolutely right. JobKeeper. the wage subsidy program, was critical. It kept employees officially linked to their employers, even if there was zero work for them to do, so they weren't counted as unemployed in the stats.
So it masked the true extent initially.
To some degree, yes. But, crucially, it did more than just hide the numbers. It maintained that vital employer-employee connection.
So businesses could ramp up faster when things reopened.
Precisely. That rapid reactivation was key to the recovery being quicker than many expected. Plus, you also had some people who were laid off but didn't immediately start looking for work, maybe due to the restrictions or health concerns, which also kept them out of the official unemployment count initially.
Okay. And prices, inflation, what happened there?
Well, overall, the reduced economic activity and more people looking for work actually eased inflationary pressures. But we saw some really specific temporary things happen too.
Yeah.
Well, childcare was made free for a period, remember, that directly pushed down its measured price in the CPI, the Consumer Price Index.
Oh, okay.
And we also saw big drops in petrol prices. Rents fell in some areas, particularly in that June 2020 quarter. It actually led to a brief period where year-ended inflation turned negative, which is pretty rare.
Okay, so a massive shock, job losses, strange price movements. But there was a huge policy response to try and cushion this blow, wasn't there?
Huge is the right word. Historically large, implemented very fast. A coordinated effort, really.
Coordinated between who?
Between the monetary policy side, that's the Reserve Bank, and the fiscal policy side, which is the government, both aiming to support demand and keep people in jobs.
Right. Let's start with the RBA then. Monetary policy, what did they do?
Well, they rolled out a pretty comprehensive package back in March 2020. First, like many central banks, they cut the cash rate target. Twice in March, down to 0.25%.
And then even lower later.
Yep, down again in November 2020 to a record low of just 0.1%.
Then with rates basically at zero, they had to pull out other tools.
Exactly. They had to turn to what we call unconventional monetary policy for the first time really in Australia.
Unconventional. Sounds interesting. What did that involve?
Several things. They gave forward guidance, basically signaling their intentions for future rates to try and influence longer-term borrowing costs. They also set a specific target for the yield on 3-year government bonds.
Why that specific bond?
It's a key benchmark. Controlling its yield helps influence lots of other interest rates across the economy. They also provided low-cost, long-term funding directly to banks, trying to encourage them to keep lending.
And kept markets running smoothly.
Yeah, adjusted their regular market operations to make sure everything functioned okay. With rates near zero, the usual lever wasn't as powerful, so they got creative, trying to keep borrowing costs low and credit flowing.
And they bought bonds too, eventually.
Yes, that came in November 2020 as well. A government bond purchase program, quantitative easing, or QE, another way to push down longer-term interest rates and pump more stimulus in.
Okay, so that's the monetary side. What about the government's fiscal response? Big spending initiatives there too.
Absolutely. Huge fiscal stimulus packages from March 2020 onwards. JobKeeper was probably the centerpiece, that wage subsidy we talked about. Just crucial for keeping businesses afloat and people paid, especially in that first half of 2020.
Yeah, JobKeeper was massive. Everyone knew someone on it, seemed like. What else was there?
Direct cash payments to households, the economic support payment, the coronavirus supplement added to JobSeeker. These gave a really significant income boost when things felt very uncertain.
And people could dip into there super early.
That was another option, yes. For businesses, you had things like the Boosting Cash Flow for Employers scheme and temporary boosts to the instant asset write-off to encourage investment.
And later things like Home Builder.
Exactly. Home builder grants to support construction, plus specific disaster payments during outbreaks, and various state government support packages for businesses too.
So a really broad range of support measures.
Very broad, designed to hit the problem from multiple angles, supporting individuals and firms.
And all this spending must have had a big impact on the government's budget.
Oh, definitely. A massive increase in government spending, federal and state. Combine that with tax revenues falling, which always happens in a downturn. It led to the largest government budget deficit since World War II in the 2020-21 financial year.
Okay, massive shock, massive response. What happened next?
As we moved into 2021, did the economy start to turn around? Was it a smooth path?
It wasn't perfectly smooth. No, we still had outbreaks and targeted lockdowns. But yes, we definitely saw a significant rebound start to take shape in 2021. As Australia got better at containing the virus for periods, as restrictions eased, and especially as the vaccine rollout gathered steam, the economy started to recover.
And all that policy support was still working its way through.
Absolutely. And remember those financial buffers. Households and businesses had actually built up savings, which is unusual in a recession. That really added fuel to the recovery.
So it bounced back faster than expected?
Generally, yes. The recovery happened earlier and with more momentum than most people initially forecast.
That's good news. Where were the strongest signs of that recovery? Household spending came back strongly. As soon as people could spend on things like dining out, domestic travel, entertainment, they did. Those government payments helped support that too.
And businesses started investing again.
They did. Confidence improved, demand was picking up, and those tax incentives helped nudge them along. In fact, by the March quarter of 2021, so quite early really, Australia's overall GDP was actually back above its pre-pandemic level.
That is quite a turnaround.
It really was. And jobs came back strongly too. Employment recovered, hours worked increased as firms rehired and needed new people in booming sectors. By mid-2021, the unemployment rate had actually fallen below where it was before the pandemic started.
Pretty remarkable overall, but I also recall hearing it wasn't quite that rosy everywhere, that the recovery was uneven.
That's a really important point. It was definitely uneven. Across industries, across regions.
Which sectors were still struggling?
Well, sectors like the arts, hospitality, tourism. They continue to be hit hard by ongoing illness, isolation rules, and of course, the closed international borders. Think about universities, for instance. Heavily reliant on international students. They faced a significant, prolonged financial pain. That has longer-term effects, too.
And regionally?
Big differences. Areas that usually rely on international tourists saw a much slower recovery than, say, regions that benefited from Aussies holidaying at home. And states like Victoria and New South Wales, because they had those longer lockdowns and were more exposed to the hit from closed international borders, their recovery was definitely more restrained initially compared to other states.
So the headline numbers looked good, but the picture on the ground was more complex.
Very much so. Averages can hide a lot of variation.
Okay. And even as we got towards the end of 2021, things felt a bit more normal maybe, but some pandemic disruptions were still lingering, right?
Yes, absolutely. Even though the basics for a sustained recovery seem to be there, high vaccination rates, borders starting to reopen, strong household and business finances, some major disruptions triggered by the pandemic were proving quite persistent.
You mean like supply chains? Everyone was talking about supply chains.
Exactly that. That massive shift in spending from services to goods during lockdowns, it put immense pressure on global production and shipping. Add in the health restrictions disrupting factories and transport hubs worldwide.
And suddenly you couldn't get things, or prices went way up?
Pretty much. Supply chains just weren't set up for that sudden demand spike for goods. It led to shortages, delays, and sharp price increases for lots of goods and raw materials. And that fed directly into higher inflation. By late 2021, inflation here was definitely stronger, more persistent than the RBA and others had initially expected, largely due to those supply costs and strong demand.
And the other big disruption people talked about was finding workers, labor shortages.
That's right. Suddenly, businesses across many industries were reporting they just couldn't find enough staff, particularly in sectors bouncing back strongly, or those that usually relied on migrant workers who couldn't get into the country.
Did that push wages up?
We started seeing stronger wages growth in specific areas where demand was really hot: IT professionals, certain trades, chefs, for example. The overall picture was still somewhat mixed, but the pressure was building in pockets.
Beyond those immediate supply and labor issues, were there signs of more lasting changes, shifts in how we live or work?
I think so, yes. The pandemic really shook up traditional work and learning, and consumer habits changed too.
Like online shopping.
That's a big one, the huge jump in online commerce, demand for home delivery, use of digital services. A lot of that seems to have stuck, even after lockdowns ended.
Which has knock-on effects.
Definitely. Think about the increased demand for home office setups, laptops, better internet, and maybe longer term, less demand for big city office blocks or traditional retail space. Businesses are still adapting their models, their investments, to these potentially permanent shifts. It's something economists are still watching very closely, trying to figure out what's temporary versus what's truly changed for good.
Right. So, to sort of wrap this up then, this deep dive into 2020 and 2021 shows the COVID-19 pandemic delivered this Well, unprecedented economic shock to Australia.
Unprecedented is the right word. Multifaceted, too.
We saw that sharp contraction initially, followed by that really swift and substantial policy response, monetary and fiscal working together.
Which was crucial.
And that response played a huge role in getting a recovery going faster than expected, even if it wasn't perfectly even across the board.
Exactly.
And threaded through all of this, the pandemic triggered these lasting disruptions, supply chains, labor markets, and seems to have genuinely shifted how we work, learn, and, well, consume things.
Precisely. It really highlighted how linked public health and the economy are. And it showed the power and maybe the necessity of bold policy action in such a crisis, even as we're still dealing with some of those longer-term consequences.
Which brings us to our final thought for you, our listener. Thinking about these longer-lasting effects, the changes to work, to learning, to how we buy things, which of these shifts do you think will have the most significant, the most enduring impact on the Australian economy in the years to come? And what new challenges or maybe even opportunities might pop up because of them? Definitely give you a lot to think about. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.